Hello everyone, welcome to Code Rage 2018. My name is Ray Konopka with Ray Software, and in this session I'm going to be talking about how to customize your controls using FMX Styles. Before I get into the actual examples, which I am calling design challenges for this presentation, I do want to spend a few minutes and talk about the various ways in which we can customize our controls. A few different options available, each to varying levels of capabilities. And so what we're going to find is to really give us the design interfaces that we're looking for, we often have to resort to customizing the styles. And so I'll describe what that all means in our initial few slides. After talking about the different ways we can customize, the next section is to describe how we do that. What are the players involved, as what I'm calling a brief history of FMX styles. If you've been using any style customizations over time, you may be familiar with some of the changes that have been made to the FMX style capabilities. I'm going to go over those, cover those, so that we regardless of what version of Rad Studio you're using, you'll be able to customize your controls to the best of the abilities the IDE provides. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the remaining portion of this session will be all about various design challenges and seeing how we can really change the way our user interfaces look by customizing the styles. So there's a couple different customization approaches that we can take when it comes to customizing a control. The most common one, and this goes all the way back to VCL development, is changing the properties. If a particular control offers various properties that affect the user interface, go ahead and change them, get the desired effect that you're looking for, and move on. Unfortunately, many of the controls in FireMonkey don't provide a whole lot of property changes, properties that allow us to change the user interface for the control. So we need to resort to some other mechanism to do that. An alternative is to actually create a custom descendant, which was very common in the VCL side. If a control didn't provide the capabilities or the visual effects that you wanted, create a custom descendant, override the paint routine, add some of your own custom properties, and voila, you can get your own custom look and feel that you're desiring. Again, the FireMonkey controls make this a little bit more challenging, and when we look at the brief history of FMX styles, we'll see why that is. But the third option that we have is to indeed use custom styles to change the appearance. The benefit of it is that it's extremely powerful, and we have a lot of opportunities to really change the way a control looks. The downside is that it can be rather complex to understand and realize what exactly is going on to make it work. That's what this session is all about. So digging into a little brief history of style support, the first thing that we want to talk about is style composition. And what I mean by that is, for each control that's in FireMonkey, if there is the functional part of the component, it's the code that describes what the component does. What role is it supposed to play? Is it a group box? Is it functioning as a button? Is it containing a list of items that you need to be able to scroll with? The core code doesn't really matter what the component looks like. The style definition describes how that control presents itself onto a design surface, and they're separate. So the idea is that I should be able to plug in any style, and as long as it's defined correctly, it will present the control in an appropriate way. Well, the way you define a style is typically done through a composition structure. It's very much like laying out a form with various controls, and controls nested in other controls and so forth. Well, when FireMonkey was first introduced, the general strategy for creating styles for the various controls was based on primitives. These were basic building blocks of creating a user interface. The easiest example of this is the shape controls that are built into FMX. They're not styled in and of themselves. They just provide a basic UI capability. And by using multiple primitives, we can make a control look the way we want. And that was how FMX built the various controls for several versions. But what happened is it worked quite well, but as the cross-platform capability to go to iOS, to go to Android came about, the controls didn't look exactly like the corresponding control on the native device. So an edit box didn't quite look the same as an edit box on an Android device versus an iOS device or a Windows device for that matter. And so in order to get a better fidelity with the native platform that it was targeting, Embarcadero switched the composition of styles. Instead of being primitive based, they actually switched it over to being bitmap rendering, which is really what the operating systems themselves do to present various controls. We're very familiar with this on the Windows side because Windows themes and styles are based off of this same concept. This is why, from going all the way back to Windows XP in the blue, green, and silver themes, first introduced this idea of bitmap rendering. And we've continued that from all the versions of Windows. iOS does it for its platforms, Android does it for its. And so while it's very powerful to do the bitmap rendering, it does limit us in a certain aspects where we don't quite have the ease of plugging in a new primitive or a new design change without kind of undoing some of the bitmap rendering. But I'll show you what we have to do to kind of get around that. The next couple pieces I wanted to highlight are two properties that all style controls have, and that's called the style lookup and the style name. And actually style name is on every control, because any control that can be a primitive or another styled control can be put into a style, and you need a way to identify that. And this will be a lot clearer when we look at the code in a few minutes. But the style lookup is what drives the contract between a particular control and the style that it's going to use. And so if we want to, we'll talk about what it means to create a custom style for a control versus a default style, and we'll see the relationship and how style lookup plays an important role in that. So if you haven't used it before, that's quite all right. We'll see examples of all of these as we move forward. And then the final kind of core piece to give our initial foundation is really what is called a style book. And this is a holder of styles. And by default, when necessary, one will get created for us, but you can also create your own. In addition, one of the things that I'll highlight later on is you're not limited to just one style book per application. And a lot of times I like to use multiples because it's easier to kind of manage the style groups that I will create. And by the end of this session, you'll understand what that means and why that is valuable. So when we get into the actual styles themselves, with this change of using bitmap rendering to present each of the controls, the concept of a style object becomes very important. And while I said before that primitives can still be used in your styles even today, and I have an example that does exactly that, all of the standard control styles are built with style objects, and There's a base T-style object, and there's a whole bunch of descendants. Some examples that are very common that you'll see quite a bit is the T-button style object and the T-button text style object. And these are specifically designed for button-like capabilities. Really what this means is if I have a control that's going to have different states in which to present itself, these are the style objects that end up getting used. And we'll look exactly at these a little bit later on in one of our design challenges, where I actually talk about how to provide custom button styling for your applications. Interestingly, that the style objects used to be strictly internal, where they were built into the standard styles and you could see that they existed, but there was no way to create your own and replace the styles that are inside of the standard controls. Fortunately, starting with 10.1 Berlin, we now have access to those style objects, and we can go and create our own custom versions. So let's move on to our design challenges. So design challenge number one involves the tab control. And I have another session on mobile view management that really talks about the importance of the tab control in mobile applications and even desktop applications. It's still quite useful for separating different views and contents. But one of the interesting things, especially if we're talking about a region that does not occupy the whole form or screen, the tab control is rather limited in the way in which it can present. The key area for this challenge is I have a tab control that is part of a larger form, but I want it to be transparent. But I still have content that I want to be able to present as separate views that animate and transition between each other. So the key style element, the design challenge that we're going to look at first, is how do we make the tab control transparent? So let's go ahead and switch over to Rad Studio here, and here is our sample form. It's a little contrived in this case. I will say that all of the examples that I'm presenting here are all based on style challenges that I have run into in real production applications. And so while the effect in the presentation demo might be a little different, it is something that I've actually run into in production development. In this case, the key is I have a little view up here. Maybe this is a developer tip of the day type of application, but I really want this to be transparent. But unfortunately, if we look at the various properties of the tab control, that there isn't anything that gives us transparency. Well, let me clarify that. Somebody might have seen that, well, there's the opacity. And yes, the opacity does change the transparency, but it also changes the transparency of all of the embedded controls. So if I were to have, any buttons or text fields that had content, and I change the opacity of the tab control, the content gets transparent as well. That's not what I want. But instead, I want to be able to make the tab control completely transparent. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to right click on the control, and down at the bottom there are two items: edit custom style and edit default style. And what this means is it all depends on how Delphi creates the structure that we're going to modify, and it's really how it creates the name. So if we're going to modify the default style, then every instance of a tab control in my application will get this new appearance. And that's exactly what we'll do in the next design challenge. But for this one, I just want this one particular tab control to become transparent. So I'm just going to select the custom style version. And when I do, the style designer comes up. And you can see, even though I had no tabs visible in design time, in the style designer, I can see that yes, as a regular tab control, it has the various presentation capabilities there. And sure enough, it is completely opaque. So let's take a look at what we see in the style designer. So there's two parts to it. The left hand side here represents the design surface of the style. The right side gives us a little preview for it. We can change the background to be either transparent blocking, to be all white, or to be all black, depending on what you're trying to look at and test. Either one of those might be of value. We can go ahead and we can actually load other style files, and we can save these things off. I'll have more to talk about this platform combo box a little bit later. But for now, we're having a design surface. And the other major area that you'll work with when dealing with the style designer is the structure pane and object inspector. So the style container itself, since I have that simply just selected, there isn't much that it's just a container from which I can have multiple styles listed. So the only one I have right now is this tab control 1 style, and I know that's a custom one because of the way it's named. It's the actual component name that I selected, edit custom style, and then style 1 is telling me just, hey, this is another style of that. Most styles will start out or be parented with a layout control, and it basically represents a design service. Think of it as a panel without any of the heavy weight of a window handle, for example. And so we have a layout that's going to contain, interestingly enough, it contains a style object, and which is a basic style object, and a scroll background. And I know what you're thinking. You look at this, it's like, well, how the heck does this describe the presentation of the tab control? And it's pretty kind of crazy in the way it works, but this is where the style object comes in. And if we look at some of the properties some more, we will see that there's all kinds of things about this source link, and there's a reference to this thing called a source lookup, which is referencing some PNG image. And we can go ahead and click on the source link here, and let's bring this up, and what we'll see is that there's images that are available in the default style that is included with our application. So it's not in our style book, but it's in the main style settings that our application gets. And so we don't have direct access to this Windows 10 desktop, but because I'm editing this under Windows 10, the IDE and the environment gives me access to that. And so here are all the bitmap pieces of the Windows 10 desktop style image. And if we look, there's different sections of what we need to reference, and here is the bounds and border of what a tab control looks like. I'll explain these kind of double bars and things a little bit later, but it's really just giving us the core piece in there. Let me go ahead and cancel this at this stage. I'm not going to worry about the resolutions at this stage. We can have actually multiples. It'll scale them and adjust them appropriately if we wanted to. If we go, the key challenge that I'm trying to solve without digging too much deeper into the structure of all of this is to be able to make this control transparent. And so one of the simplest ways to do that is to simply make this object not visible. And so if I make that not visible, then my tab control goes away. What's interesting is that the tabs themselves is handled by a different style. It's not the tab control style. And so that's why we don't have any settings for that. That's why when I change the visible of this style object to be false, I still see the tabs over in here in the preview. But I'm not using tabs, so I'm okay with it. So another little, I guess more of a tip, because at this point I've changed the style and I want to apply it to the control that's on my form sitting over in the tab control styling form. So you would be tempted to say, okay, apply the style, and it should go and apply the style to it. But if I go, and it does, so it actually does tell the component that, hey, I've got a new style here. The other problem though is when I go and close the style designer, even though I've applied it, I get a prompt saying apply changes as before closing the editor. So I rarely use the apply button and just go ahead and close it and go ahead and make sure the change gets applied. And so what's really nice is now these are only design time surface controls, but if I go ahead and run this, I will see that it's a completely transparent area up there. And if I wanted to go ahead and put, a particular control on that tab sheet, then that would certainly still become visible when I would run it. And I could have my label on there and do my tab transitions, and everything would animate within that bounding rectangle. So that's a nice, really quick way to get rid of our tab control bounds and make it transparent. So the key points in this example were to illustrate the style book. How do we get into the style designer for the style book, and the difference between editing a default style and the custom style. We edited a custom style. In the next design challenge, we're going to edit the default style. And this next design challenge is to customize the group box. One of the things you may have noticed is that in the new 10.3 Rio IDE for Ed Studio, the options dialogues have been redesigned, reworked to better categorize items, to present things in a much cleaner way, getting rid of extra lines and delineations, just overall cleaning up the presentation, which is wonderful. It definitely makes a big difference. One of the things that I've liked to have done for quite a long time is customize group boxes to make things a little bit cleaner, to show presentation or hierarchy rather than just a box. And the default style, certainly on Windows, has been a slightly rounded rectangle, very faint, with the new, certainly with the new Windows 8 and 10 styling. But I want to make the a top line style and actually move the text of the group heading far to the left so that I can see structure much clearer than normal. The challenge that we have with this is, again, there's no easy way to do that with properties of the group box. So let's take a look and see what that how we get around that. So let me change my active project and switch over to a form here. This is my basic kind of data entry form. This could be program options. I just decided to put a few fields on here, and one of the things that you'll note is that this control is indented quite a bit when it comes to presenting the content. And while I could indent my labels here a little bit further in, it's a little bit large for the spacing that I would like to have. But again, more importantly is I don't need the slightly colored or faint bordering for it. And if I go ahead and run this, let's see what it looks like without the designer dots. And you can see that, there isn't much emphasis here. There's really no structure or grouping, I've lost a little bit of that. So let's see what we can do to fix that. So again, I'm going to right click on one of the controls I'm interested in. In this example, I want to change the default style, meaning that all of my group boxes that I'm going to use in my application will pick up this new style, which is really what I want to do. So let me edit the default style, and in here we see a little bit more of the structure of the control. And if we open this up, we're going to see that there's a background, which is another style object, as well as a text component for it. And it's a T text, which is different than a T label. So T label exists over on the standard tab. If we scroll down and find the shapes page, we will see that inside of there is a text. The shapes are primitives, and so we'll see how we're going to use one of these in just a minute. But at this point, the label uses a text object in its style. And so anytime we have text presented on a control, it's usually supported by a text primitive or a text shape. So what is it that we wanted to change here? Well, we don't want this background image in here. And so like the tab bar, if we look at the style object and scroll down, we are going to see that it's still referencing that Windows 10 desktop, and we have this source link which is providing reference to what represents the group box. Well, here is the PNG image of the group box bordering, and you can kind of see if we zoom in a little bit more, and again it's hard because it's the transparent, there's a little bit of curvature in each of those corners. And so we can go ahead and zoom out and go ahead and close this, because I actually don't want to use this image. I could use part of it, but then the problem with that is there's easier ways to manage this. And one thing to note is if we look at the group box style, it's a layout, and that the background object itself is named background because the group box component needs to reference the text and the background for any changes that it makes. So we need to make sure we know those names. Let's take a look at that is aligned client. And so, but the text itself goes above. And so how is the aligned client not taking the top all the way to the area there? Well, there's two ways that can happen. Either the margins is set on the style object, the background, or the padding is going to be set down on the layout control. And so here, sure enough, the bounding, the little rectangle is, or the image coming from the PNG base source, is indented a little bit all the way around, except at the top it's indented by 8, meaning 8 down from the bottom, and that's why the text splits the height of that control. If the control were to change its font size, well, that 8 pixel value needs to be adjusted, and so inside the code it would adjust that, it would scale it as the font size would change in order to keep that centered. But for what we're doing, we're not going to worry about any of that because we're going to change it up a little bit. So when it comes time to add, I want to replace this background style object with just a rectangle primitive. So the easiest thing to do is, and it's just because it can get kind of confusing trying to drag things over and to click on things in this design surface, is I like to select the parent of where I want my new control to be placed. And so I'm putting it into the group box style layout, and then I'll go and double click the control that I want, and as we can see, I now have a new element, new control inside of my style. I'm going to align this to the client, and so it matches the same as my background object. And then but I don't want this background object. I want to change it over to this. So I'm going to take the text object and move it to be parented by the new rectangle. I also am going to delete the old style object. So I'll take that away, and it looks really crazy because all of a sudden my style went away. I did just delete the old style object. If I go and click on the group style, it's still there. And then in order to make sure that the style is still fully recognizable by the group box control, I need to change the style name of this new rectangle to be background. And so now we can see that this looks exactly the way it did before. But of course I'm not done. This just makes my control use a big gray box, but that's not what I'm looking for. Let's fix that first. So with the background rectangle selected, let's go find the fill property and change that to none. And so now I have a transparent box, but I don't even want the box. So let's go to the sides and get rid of the other sides. So we're clearly getting much closer. Let's take let's go into the stroke property, and I'm going to change that to 2. Let's make that look a little bit bolder, and we can even go in and change the color. And so I can take this, and let's see, what do we got here? How about a dark slate blue? Oh, that's too, we need something brighter. How about the corn? There we go, cornflower blue. Oh, that's kind of nice. And so we can customize the coloring that we want to use. And however, the final step is I still want I want the text to be furthest to the left. Well, let's go and take a look at the text control and see how this is getting positioned. So if we open this up, we can see that the X position is 15 pixels in. Well, that's easy enough. Let's just change that to 0 and have it aligned to the left of my control. And I think that looks pretty good for what I'm looking for. So let me go ahead and I'll close this up. We'll save it. And now when I go to my form, I've got the new style affecting both the contact information group and the billing address group. And so I can go ahead and run this real quick. We can see what it looks like without the design circles, and it's another way of separating the control out to give a different look and feel. So again, very powerful capabilities when we start digging into the styles to change our user interface. So the key points that we covered in this particular group box example was the importance of style object names, making sure that when we replace a style object, we keep the structure of style objects intact with their names so that the control that we're customizing can access those styles if they need to reference them, to make changes and so forth. The next design challenge is customizing an activity indicator, and this was a recent issue that I had run into in developing a mobile application for both iOS and Android, and it didn't use the standard styling of the OS. And instead it had a custom theme. It was the look and feel was equivalent on both the Android and the iOS device. The styling was a dark base theme but blended in with some light color elements. In particular, I was making an activity indicator panel that would pop up to show that there was some activity going on, and it had an activity message, you can see an example in the mobile view management session I have in Code Rage as well, but it was like retrieving data or processing request, and along with it was the activity indicator showing that it was actually doing work. The problem is that the activity indicators that are included in Red Studio for all of the platforms are all designed for a light colored background. And so my challenge is I had a dark colored background, and so the activity indicator wouldn't show up. What was even worse was that the original version was green based, and the activity indicator by default on Android is green based, and so it was almost invisible when we ran it on that. And so the challenge is, how do we incorporate a new activity indicator that we can leverage as a lighter based, works on a dark background, and leverage that and even further dive into customizing our style. So let's take a look at how we can do that. So let me switch to my activity indicator sample program, and here is the basic app that I'm demonstrating. This little activity panel here, got a processing request tag and a nice little progress indicator showing me activity. And since I'm running under Windows, I go ahead and run this. I'm going to see that it's the momentum dots that we're quite used to seeing in Windows 10, and as that rotates, we get the little dots. Okay, great. The challenge, of course, and if we switch this to other platforms, like Android, we see that it's the green circle, and if we switch it to iOS, it's that activity indicator as well. But I'm going to switch back to Windows here. And then what I see is, well, what I wanted to in my application was the background. I wanted that to actually be something much darker. And so I had changed it to, well, I can do one of the dark slate gray. It's kind of a greeny blue letter there. Of course, I would change my text settings and change the color for that to be white. And I'd probably want to change my rectangles outline to also be white. And so I have this new look. The problem is there's no properties to change the activity indicator, and so it's very hard to read on those. It's even worse when you switch it to iOS, because the indicator is so small and it's alpha blended, so you can't even see it. And then, as I mentioned before, on Android, it's a little bit doesn't have enough contrast. So how can we go ahead and fix this? So as we've been doing in all our previous examples, let's right click on our control and let's edit the custom style. And what's interesting about this control or this style is the way it's structured. It uses an image, not a layout, and an animation object, specifically a bitmap list animation, which as it's designed animates the bitmap property of the parent, meaning the image control, with a list of images, and those images are defined from the animation bitmap, and how it iterates through them is described by the animation count and the row count. And then where that image comes from is from the Windows Desktop Rings Black bitmap. And if we go ahead and click on the animation bitmap, we can see what all those look like. And so one of the first things that you might try to do here is to actually clear this. Since I have access to it, go ahead and load your custom version of your activity indicator, and go ahead and click OK and change the settings to what they're appropriately to be. In this case, it's 16 by 1. And if I go ahead and save this, apply it to the control, well, nothing's there, and let me go ahead and run it. And what we'll see is that it's very hard, but there's some black little dots and things that are showing up, and that's because inside of our style book it's still referencing the Windows 10 images. Now we can actually clear that and then reload it, but it has a tendency that it's only partially defined. What we really want to do to fix this is we want to add our own image into the style and see how we can leverage that. So to do that, we're going to go all the way up to the style container and then add in a new image. So we're going to double click the new image, and we can go ahead and name this. Now it's not the name property, we want the style name. As one of the biggest differences when you start working with the style designer, that you want to change the name property, because that's how we do it when we build our user interfaces in the form designer. But in the style designer, you change the style name. And so this is going to be called, we'll call this white sector ring image. And because it's an image itself, let's go ahead and load it. And we do that through the multi-res bitmap. We'll go ahead and open up our sector ring file, bring that in. It's 512 by 32. We'll go ahead and close that down. Now we'll go back over to our animation object, and instead of having it reference that built-in Windows 10 desktop image, we're going to change this to white sector ring image, and then we'll go in and edit that, and we can see it's already been updated with our new image content. We don't have to do anything special with it. And so now, because these are all set up, I can go ahead and save this. And now we can see that our sector ring is indeed set up. So let me go ahead and run this real quick. And we can see that we have indeed our new activity indicator, which looks very good on a dark background and will work with other environments. Now, one of the things to note is, like, what happens when we go and switch this to iOS? It's still going back to the other one, and where this comes into play is in how this style gets set, and it can get a little bit tricky. It's because when we open up the style book now, we can see that there is a default and a Windows 10 desktop. So because I'm on the Windows 10 desktop and that's how that was created, it's actually showing it appropriately. What I really want, though, is I want the default to have this custom style as well, so that it would apply to all of those. So in order to fix that, I have to go into the style book, and what we can see is that we have this default, and if we pick that, then my styles go away and I have my Windows 10. So the way you fix this is I don't need the defaults. Let me go ahead and take that away, and now I'm back without that. My Windows 10 is still in there, but what I can still fix that when I close the style designer. So let me close that, go back over to my set of styles, and now the platform I'm just going to delete. And so that is my new default. And so now if I go and change this to be, say, iOS, it still shows me the correct indicator that I want. And so that is something that can be rather tricky when you want to have something go across multiple platforms. If you want it to be individual and change it, by all means, leverage the capabilities of having that platform in the style book, and you can have a different image for each platform, which is what Embarcadero does for the basic functionality. Okay, we have one more design challenge to deal with, and that is creating some custom buttons. So if you're going to be building a very custom interface that has an appropriate style, it may not you may not need to replace the entire style with the full style file, but you want to customize some buttons and things. In this example, I've already got set up so that I just have to show you kind of the key points and a couple key pieces in here. And so let's go ahead and take a look, and you'll see what effect I'm looking for. But more importantly, we'll look into the style book to see how we get this. And so one of the things I wanted is I needed a specialized button. I wanted to have different states. It was actually an orange color that fit with the coloring of the UI that I was building, and it had a special image that I wanted to use for the back button. And you can see it's just a back button. There's no text, doesn't need it. Here's the close button that was being used. And one of the things to note was when I built the button, I did want it to scale. So if I had different sizes, I wanted the bordering to look and feel the same way regardless of the button size, just like a regular button. And because this is custom though, there's a certain technique that you can use in order to accomplish that. So let's take a look at the style book that I've created here, because each of these controls are all just buttons, and I've just styled them appropriately by using the style lookup property to access my style book for the right style. And so this is an orange button. Let me go back to that. So orange button style. This is an orange button style. This is the close button style, and this one is the back button style. So let's take a look at what these look like in the style designer. And here we have multiple styles all in one. I've brought in images like I did before. In this case, and what's nice is you can certainly resize and scale these up to get a better view. It's not changing anything for the sizing, it just allows us to see that. The same thing if we look into here, this shows us the images that are used for the various states. So if we want to click it, and each one represents a different state. So the hot, the disabled, and the pressed versions, and of course the regular. That will be important because when we say go to the back button, the back button is set up just like a regular button control. It has a background which is going to represent the images, and then there's if you had a text element. I'm not having that set, so there's no text that's used here. It could be deleted, but I tend not to because the button control is going to want to reference the text property to blank it out or to access it. So I keep it there, I'm just not using it. And then the background is referencing the source lookup goes after my new bitmap images. So the PNG file that's included in the style sheet. And then we have to go to the various properties to describe what it is, what represents this button. So if we go to the normal link and we open this up, we get our little dialog, and this just shows us a bounding rectangle for the normal state of the back button. And you can move this, you can drag this around, you can resize it so that it encompasses all that you want, and that's what I did. You have access to the other links. There's a hot link here, and then the focused link, so I can get to them again from the object inspector, or I can just click on them here. So here's the hot link, here's the focused, and then this is the pressed. And as you can imagine, the close button does exactly the same. But the cool one that I wanted to show is the actual orange button. So the orange button has these larger rectangles, various states, and if we go to the orange button style, it has the same kind of structure, has a background style object. There's a glyph in there as well if we wanted to have an image displayed on the button. But then if we look at the background, we can see that it's going after the orange button source. Let's go find the normal link again, bring this up, and what we see is the rectangle is a little bit different. Rather than just one bounding rectangle encompassing the border, there's a nested rectangle. And what this is allowing us to do is to do image slicing. So we are defining the border of the control and each corner. And so when this image needs to be applied to a bitmap, the corners and the edges are displayed intact, but the middle area is stretched to fill it. And so it does allow us to have the images, the buttons, be any size, and have it look correct when it doesn't distort the corners. And so the way that's handled is changing each of these properties. If you wanted to change it, just grab the handle and make it and move it in or out. The reason why they're so far in is because the curvature of the image is what we want to use to make sure that we don't distort that. And so I wanted to show the slicing capabilities that's inside the bitmap links editor. And so go ahead and close my style designer, and we're back to our main form. So those are all the style design challenges that I have today. I hope there was some good information that you can take back and start customizing your FMX controls by using the style capabilities that's built into Rad Studio, using the style designer, remembering to keep the names of the style objects that you use intact so that the controls know how to get to them. Be able to reference images, customize your style settings, and hopefully meet all of your design challenges in your user interfaces. Thank you so much for watching this presentation. I will be on the live Q&A portion and hopefully answer any questions you might have. Thank you very much and enjoy the rest of Code Rage 2018.